Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give it another minute or two while people get settled and get joined, and we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give it another minute or two. We'll get settled and get joined, and we'll get started. Okay, we'll get started here. Welcome everybody to this week's NACDA webinar. My name is Dana Leroy. I'm the Communications Manager for NACDA. We're glad to have you with us for this very important session on one of the hot topics in college athletics today, and that is name, image, and likeness. NACDA is fortunate to have the industry's best and brightest minds on the subject here with us. I'm really excited about this panel, and I'll introduce them here quickly before we dive right into the discussion. First, we have Kevin Lennon, Vice President of Division I at the NCAA. Kevin has been with the NCAA for over 30 years and serves as the lead staff member working with the NCAA Division I Board of Directors, Division I Presidential Forum, and Division I Council, and also serves as the primary liaison with the Knight Commission. Also joining from the NCAA, we have Jenn Fraser, Managing Director of Division I. Jenn has served in this capacity since 2015 and has significant experience with the NCAA's governance processes, having spent 3 years previously working in the National Office's Division II Governance Group and in the Eligibility Center. Grace Calhoun is the Director of Athletics and Recreation at Penn, a position she's held since 2014. She's served in the collegiate athletics industry for more than 25 years, and she has done a remarkable job serving as chair of the NCAA Division I Council this year. We are proud to honor her last summer as an Under Armour Athletics Director of the Year at the NACDA and Affiliates Convention in Orlando. Another perspective we have from the AD chair this afternoon will be coming from Jill Bodensteiner, Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University. She is coming up on her 2-year anniversary in this position after an impressive 20-year run at her alma mater, Notre Dame. Jill is a member of the NCAA's Federal and State Legislation Working Group, the NIL Legislative Solutions Working Group, and she is also chair of the Individual Licensing Subgroup. Before I turn things over to this all-star panel, I want to remind attendees that you may ask questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature in the Zoom window. We will have time for allotted questions after the presentation. This live stream is also being broadcast on NACDA's YouTube channel. So for those of you who might have had colleagues that were unable to join via Zoom, they can still tune into the live session by going to youtube.com/ADNACDA. As with previous sessions, a recording of this webinar, as well as the presentation slides, will be made available to all registrants via email, as well as all NACDA and affiliates members via the NACDA Daily Review. And with that, I'll hand the baton over to Grace.
Okay, thank you so much, Dana. I'm honored to be a part of this panel today and spending some time with you. My role is to get us kicked off by giving a framework and understanding that we have people on the call that are probably very new to this topic, to many who might be quite well educated. I'll try to level set and get us all established with the same framework, and then we'll jump into the material. So it's important to understand that the association-wide Board of Governors charged a task force, which was the federal and state legislative working group, with looking at the modernization of rules around name, image, and likeness in the NCAA. And that working group did outstanding work. They met for just about exactly a year and came up with a document which was delivered to the association-wide Board of Governors last week. As you're aware, that working group consisted of presidents, athletic directors, commissioners, SWAs, faculty members, and at all levels of, or all three divisions within the NCAA. So it was a broad-based group. They were charged with looking at the issues very conceptually, and the document they delivered did just that. It really provided a wonderful context and a very thoughtful review of name, image, and likeness. In October, the Board of Governors additionally charged each of the three subdivisions with starting to think about what the legislative solutions would look like at the three divisional levels. So starting in December, Division 1 formed what we call our Legislative Solutions Group, the topic of this webinar today. And that group consisted of the non-presidential Division 1 members of the federal and state working group, combined with the Division 1 Council's leadership, a group we call our coordination committee. So the combination of those two bodies, again, formed this overall legislative solutions group. And within that group, we've had many meetings of the full group, but also have formed various subgroups or working groups to deal with the issues. And over the course of many months, we found that we've really been able to dive in to take the concepts being developed or now formalized by that federal and state working group, and really, again, put them into action in thinking about what the legislation should look like in Division 1. As we move forward, we're really trying to focus on two things. One being the fact that we need to continue to educate the membership. And every member that I've talked to of both the federal and state legislative working group, and now specifically the legislative solutions group within Division 1, has acknowledged that this has really been a process for them, and very much an evolutionary one, where we've all gotten to a place much further along in being permissive with the thoughts around what the legislation could look like than when we started out, because I think we acknowledge that we are very regulatory minded, very policy minded as an association. So we've had to get comfortable with the fact that we're dealing with things that aren't overly natural, or the way our minds perhaps aren't trained to think. But it certainly has been a very healthy process, and we found that through webinars like today, the ability to interact with the membership, to hear your questions, to get your best thinking, and to help you not only come along, but to really give that important feedback to those involved with the working group to ensure that the solutions we come up with are as strong as possible is really important. And then secondly, as we look at how this is working through our leadership group, our NCAA Council, we had a wonderful conversation, I guess now about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the council initially looked at just over 20 legislative concepts and had the opportunity to give feedback on those concepts. And I'm pleased to see in all but one case, there was very strong support for the initial concepts. So we feel we're on the right path. We acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. We have many questions questions remaining, and we continue to actively, interface with the membership to get your best thinking, your questions, and your advice to us as we look to refine these concepts. So again, we're excited to have this opportunity today. I'm next going to look to Jenn and Kevin to walk us through the slides that you better understand the types of things that we're thinking about and where questions lie. And then Jill is going to come back and pull this all together for us. And then second half is to engage you all in questions and answers. So thanks again for joining us today. And Jenn and Kevin, I'll kick to you to go through the slides.
Thanks, Grace. It's great to be with everyone. And Dana, you can take us to the next slide if you would. I'd like to thank, as Grace did, you all for being with us today. And in particular, I'd like to thank our friends at NACDA for providing this platform for us to be with you. It's been a real pleasure to support the Legislative Solutions Group from the staff perspective, and we're really glad to be sharing their work with you all today. As noted both by Dana and Grace, we do have a fair amount of time dedicated at the end of our time together today for Q&A. So you have two ways you can send those in, and we'll be happy to facilitate those at the end, either through the Q&A function, the bubble that's on the bottom of your screen, or through the chat feature. We'll handle those both ways. And if there's something that we don't get to today, just know that we'll capture it, and we'll either directly contact you to provide that information for you and make sure that the Legislative Solutions Group gets that information. So we're going to start off with a bang and just dive right in. There are a few statements that you're going to hear us say rather frequently, both today and as we talk about these concepts going forward. And one of those is that this model is built on no institutional involvement. The future of name, image, and likeness activities for student athletes is presumed to be their business, their product, their service, and not have institutional involvement. That is in that top bubble there. You'll hear us reference that frequently. You'll hear moments when we start to talk about a concept and a question will be asked that sort of spills it from permissible as it's contemplated here into institutional involvement, which would make it an impermissible activity. So really start to ground yourself in the fact that these are activities by a student athlete that do not have institutional involvement. Early iterations of the Legislative Solutions Group presentations through webinars and through materials had these activities in three categories. As discussions have progressed, the activities have started to merge into two categories: student athlete business activities, both athletically related and non-athletically related, and third-party promotional activities. The bullets that are included here for your reference are examples of what would be permissible in a future environment. They're not intended to be all-inclusive, and the group is really intentional about using these as examples for where the future could go. But when legislation is adopted, I wouldn't expect to see this laundry list of examples appear in the manual, because as we've learned over the last few years, the future evolves rather quickly and the legislation just won't be able to keep up with it. Next slide, Dana. A little bit later today, Kevin's going to share some more detail on the contents of this slide. I want to pause and note that while these items are couched under the header of additional considerations, it doesn't mean that the Legislative Solutions Group hasn't done work. It's just simply that we're not at a place where these are prepared to be presented in a fully formed fashion. There is still work to be done. Grace noted, and Dana noted Jill's leadership, that there are subgroups of the full group that have been working on some of these over the course of time. Right now, we've got disclosure and professional service providers that are really the focus of our subgroups. And that's how these items are coming together. So not that work hasn't been done, we're just not quite prepared for concepts to be presented. We've just got some questions for you all. Before we move on to the specifics of the examples, I just want to pause for a moment and draw your attention to the pale green parameters for institutional assistance. Again, we noted early on that these activities do not have institutional involvement. And the Legislative Solutions Group acknowledges that institutional involvement is different from institutional assistance. And clarity around the difference, parameters around what is permissible for institutions to provide by way of assistance, different from institutional involvement, will be sought in a legislative solution. Okay, Dana, we can jump to the athletically and non-athletically related business line. One more, if you wouldn't mind, please. Thank you. So again, we're going to talk about specific examples now. Student athletes, athletically and non-athletically related business activities. For these activities to be permissible activities in a new name, image, and likeness environment, institutions may not be involved. Again, different than providing assistance, but not involved in the activities. No institutional marks may be used, and the institution is not permitted to purchase the student athlete's product or service. So as we talk about specific examples, ground yourself in these being the foundation in what would make those specific examples permissible. So let's briefly walk through those examples on the next slide. They're listed here for you in a simple format, and again, examples only, not exhausted. The first of a permissible business activity under a revised name, image, and likeness environment is fee for lesson and camping clinic. This is one that is fairly unanimously supported, not only by the Legislative Solutions Group, but as Grace noted, the council was really supportive of it, as are folks in the membership when we start talking about a future environment. If adopted, a student athlete could use their NIL to promote private lessons and to promote and run a camping clinic. The next item is another one where there's pretty resounding support: promotion of a student athlete's athletically or non-athletically related business activity. This is their own business activity. This is the bullet that captures the references that we've made previously to the previously approved waivers list, that institutions are doing this for non-athletically related business activities, and this would take it to include athletically related business activities. Important to note that in the model that's contemplated by the Legislative Solutions Group, in the promotion, the student athlete would be able to reference their status as a student athlete and their institutional affiliation, but we draw the line again at use of institutional marks as not permissible. The next two examples on the slide have garnered lively discussions. And at this time, the Legislative Solutions Group supports the sale of memorabilia owned by the student athlete, albeit reluctantly. And this is that one that Grace noted that there wasn't majority support at the initial reaction of council. It was agreed that feedback is really important and appropriate guardrails should be established around the sale of memorabilia that is owned by the student athlete. This is contemplated with a caveat that says institutions wouldn't be able to provide student athletes with memorabilia for the sole purpose of the student athlete being able to sell them. It started to become clear that this really hinges on that word owned and when a student athlete truly owns something. In our current legislative environment, it's permissible for a student athlete to sell their memorabilia once they've exhausted eligibility. And this would move that to being permissible while they're still a student athlete, provided they own those items. The group is really thinking about this on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, the student athlete would own a piece of memorabilia at the point the institution is no longer retrieving it from the student athlete. And on the other end of the spectrum, it would maintain that after eligibility. There's a lot of questions and a lot of sadness with contemplating an environment where a student athlete is selling those items. So this is one where there's a lot of questions still to be answered. And the final bullet before I turn it over to Kevin is about autographs. And that if you've heard Val Ackerman, who chaired the association-wide group, she talks a lot about autographs being one of the top 4 things that are asked about anytime you start talking about a new name, image, and likeness environment. It is the epitome of an individual's name, image, and likeness, their own signature. And where the Legislative Solutions Group is focused on permitting the sale of autographs is setting up parameters for when it's permissible for a student athlete to sell those autographs and when it wouldn't be permissive. For example, during team activities like post-game, the sale wouldn't be permitted. They're still representing the institution. The sale of autographs, like other activities that we've talked about today, have to be done on the student athlete's own time. There's a great deal of interest in maintaining the community and fan engagement that we've become accustomed to, like post-game autograph sessions. And this is one where the working group is looking for those appropriate parameters about when a student athlete is representing the institution and it wouldn't be permissible, and when it would be permissible as their own business activity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to take us through the next couple of sessions before we open it up for question and answer. Thanks, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Jen, and it's nice to be with all the NACDA colleagues and friends, and appreciate the time, Bob, that you've given us to be with you today. Let's talk now about the second grouping that Jen referenced earlier, and this would be the third-party advertisements and promotions. And if we could go to that slide, Dana, that would be great. You can go to the next one. So Jen has just gone through all of the student-athlete business-related opportunities that would be permitted in a new NIL environment. And this grouping here relates, again, to third-party advertisements and promotions. So you'll see from the first bullet here, and this is really, I think, kind of the all-encompassing component, it would permit compensation for endorsement of a commercial product for a charitable, educational, or nonprofit entity. And so we'll dive into that concept in a little bit more detail in a moment, but this is one of the kind of cornerstones, if you will, of this third-party endorsement and promotion category. Much like you heard from Jen, institutions would not be involved in securing the arrangement for student athletes. So again, these are student athletes initiated activities without a level of institutional involvement that she had described previously. In this category as well, there would be no institutional marks used. And in this category, there would also be the distinction that a student athlete would not be able to mention their institutional affiliation. That begins, and that's encompassed within this concept of kind of institutional marks. So again, this clear separation between the student athlete and the institution in this regard. The 3 bullets that you see on the bottom here represent the type of activities in this category that drive down to kind of a level of specificity. So what are we talking about with third-party promotions? First of all, a student would be permitted to model apparel, and that would be obviously a change in the way the current legislation applies. Secondly, that they would be able to endorse a commercial product or service. And I think the analogy that folks have used often is kind of like the Aaron Rodgers commercial, if you will, where you see that there are no marks, et cetera, but an opportunity to promote a commercial product in that way. And then the third area is the personal appearances, that a student athlete would be permitted to be compensated for a personal appearance. So this is the second grouping, along with Jen's first grouping, which represents kind of the totality in the concepts in terms of a more permissible name, image, and likeness environment. Let's go to the next slide, please. And you can go to the topic still under review. Why don't we go to this number 23 that starts with topics still requiring review and discussion. We'll do this for purposes of time, and we'll pick up all of these in a one slide format. That's perfect, Dana. Thank you. So this is kind of an important transition, if you will. We've just talked about the type of things that the Legislative Solutions Group was comfortable with a student doing on their own that they've initiated. And I really encourage all of you to think broadly, as Grace has shared with you, about the permissibility of that environment for a student athlete. But importantly, the Legislative Solution Group has said, before we're ready to go forward with legislative concepts, there obviously are additional guardrails or parameters that need to be discussed so that people can get comfortable with what represents a significant change as being suggested by Jen and myself through these previous slides. What you see on the list are topics that have been discussed by the Legislative Solutions Group, but more work is continuing in each of these areas because they have been identified as important additional considerations that need to be fleshed out so that the membership can be comfortable. I'm going to hit these at kind of a high level, and then we'll respond in certain questions that you may have. So pre-enrollment. When Division I comes up with our rule, what should the pre-enrollment environment be for a 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grader? Should they be required to act in ways that are consistent with the Division I rules? Or should they be permitted to defer, if you will, to what the high school or secondary school rules are and then discontinue whatever may have been impermissible prior to that? That is an ongoing conversation within the Legislative Solutions Group. Professional service providers, Jill is doing a great job of leading this particular area. There's a recognition that young people will need to make informed decisions about these opportunities, whether that be agents, if you will, or marketing professionals or tax professionals, whatever they may be. What would be a permissible engagement of what we call a professional service provider to help a young person? I distinguish that from someone who markets them to a professional league, where they've clearly said that is not permissible. But how does a young person navigate these potential opportunities, and what type of service may be helpful to them? Disclosure and institutional expectations. I think there's an understanding that a young person, as they get into these opportunities, would need to disclose what the activity is. They need to disclose the compensation arrangements and a number of other specifics in terms of disclosure, not for purposes necessarily of approving it, but of making sure that there is compliance with the expectations that the division would have established through this process. So there's clearly an understanding of disclosure. And obviously institutional expectations. What is the expectation of an institution as it relates to the monitoring of these activities are the type of things that the group is continuing to talk about. The fourth bullet, booster. So we all know, and this was clear in the federal and state legislative working group, is we don't want boosters in the environment where a student's name, image, and likeness is used as a recruiting tool or is used as a means of an extra benefit to retain a student at an institution, that there need to be appropriate parameters around booster activities to make sure that we have integrity in the recruiting process and it is not in any way tainted through this improper use of name, image, and likeness. Some of that could be accomplished through disclosure elements that boosters would need to be provided. There's lots of guardrails that need to be worked on in this area. And my sense is that the NACDA membership could be quite helpful to the working group as we move forward and think about those things. Conflicts with values. So while you have a more permissive name, image, and likeness environment, there may be things that we're not comfortable as an association with student athletes being engaged with. It could be sports wagering as an example, because by doing that, you render yourself ineligible. There may be other conflicts at the local level. They conflict with institutional values, or perhaps they conflict with sponsorship arrangements that you have that are important to supporting the opportunities for your student athletes. How do we resolve those issues of potential conflicts? And that's something the group is talking about. Jen has already mentioned institutional assistance, how to help a young person, and distinguishing that from institutional involvement, where you're precluded from promoting and developing and marketing the opportunity. What is the appropriate level of assistance consistent with how we support young people through their athletic and academic experiences? Additional areas of the business activities that Jen has just talked about there, particularly related to memorabilia and autographs, will require additional kind of conversations. And then the final issue is one of gender equity. And this was very clear in the report of the federal and state legislative working group, is that we always need to be attentive to Title IX and to gender equity concerns. This one relates particularly to the type of institutional assistance that we'd be provided to make sure that it is in fact equitable moving forward. I've quickly hit those notes, but what I want you to know is often we get questions on these type of areas saying, I am comfortable with students doing these new activities, but I need answers around these elements here before I'm ready to kind of move forward with full support. And with the excellent support of Grace and her leadership and Bob Bowlesby and Jill doing what she's doing, I think the group is situated to move forward with these concepts on your behalf to make sure that then they're shared at the appropriate time with the broader membership so that we can work towards a legislative solution that will help our young people moving forward. So with that, Jill, I'll turn it over to you as a wrap up.
Great. Thanks so much to my great colleagues for that presentation. I think what I'm going to do, I was ready to play cleanup if there was anything that I felt like needed to be added, but there really isn't. So maybe the perspective I could offer would be some tips on preparing yourself on campus. So I'll offer a few thoughts in that regard, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. The first is, as we all know, education, 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 and that's maybe obvious, but a few things I'll note. I think the Atlantic 10, my conference, has done a fabulous job of sort of pre-education. So we've been working through this with our SWAs, with our FARs, certainly the athletic directors, our student athlete leaders. I think it's a lot to wait till this all gets passed and then sort of roll it out as an education piece. So I would highly suggest some pre-work to be done on the education front. And, this is compliance plus. I know all compliance is a shared responsibility, but this in really unique ways, can't be seen as a compliance only. Your external relations staff, your marketing, the folks, either your multimedia rights partners or internal liaisons there too. This is a world that a whole new group of people really need to understand what the rules are. So I see quite a few of those folks on the attendee list today, which is a great sign. In addition, in prep work from the compliance office, I know when I worked in compliance at Notre Dame, I did not have a great understanding of our own corporate sponsors. So there needs to be some serious cross communication as you prepare to comment on some of the issues that are still pending. And then depending on what we all decide as a membership, a thorough understanding of that market and where you are as an institution. I think it's a good time to survey your campus resources. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that we already offer some courses on brand management and those sort of things for all students. So what's out there? What exists? Our communications and marketing departments and art departments are doing a great job of offering courses such as digital storytelling. Those might be things that you can sort of combine and have ready to introduce your student athletes, and again, all students too. Understand the market. I think one of the most eye-opening moments of this entire one-year journey for me was maybe back in the fall when we heard from a group of social media influencers, and it was like a language that was really foreign to me. And I learned a ton about what's out there and what the market is, and what Cameo is all about, and what that business model is, and how the social media influencer, I started to see emails from brand managers to students saying, hey, I see you have the possibility, you have X number of followers and have the possibility to be an influencer. And so if you don't understand that market and what's out there, take the time to educate yourself. And then finally, early discussions with your campus council. So the Title IX issue that Kevin just raised, the conflicts issue that Kevin talked about. He talked about association-wide, perhaps sort of values conflicts. Are there things on your own campus? If we presume that institutions will have the opportunity to add any thoughtful restrictions on their own, are you prepared to know sort of where your values lie on that front? So those are some thoughts. I mean, everybody, Grace, from Grace to Jenn to Kevin, gave a beautiful summary. I think it's really clear, and the most questions that I get are about, does institutional involvement include our multimedia rights partners? What's the situation with institutional sponsors? We're feeling overwhelmed as a compliance office. How are we going to deal with this? I will offer, I have a 1.5 person compliance office now. I appreciate that. I think that this is an opportunity for the members to weigh in on the disclosure and institutional expectations conversation in particular. Would love to hear your feedback on what should be the role of the institution vis-a-vis perhaps conferences, vis-a-vis NCAA or another national approach. But again, to go back to my tips, I think what is clear when Jenn talked about institutional involvement, and Kevin mentioned institutional assistance versus institutional involvement, is that we are going to have the responsibility to do some educating. So again, preparing to not just wait until these are enacted to start that education process. So I'll leave it at those comments, and let's dig into Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jill and Grace and Kevin. You know, Jill, you just kind of provided your synopsis there about the types of questions that we rather frequently hear, and maybe questions and concerns. And those are exactly the types of things that are being shared by participants today. So let's maybe start with information about the possibility of a third-party entity that could help monitor, maybe a clearinghouse is a word that's been used previously, that could alleviate some of that stress and pressure on a compliance shop going into the future. So let's share with everybody what we're thinking about the possibility of a third-party entity.
And when you say let's share, is that me?
Yeah, you go ahead and start, and I can certainly supplement if need be.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. So I think, so Jen, the concept that we've been talking about, and there's a separate subgroup that neither Grace nor I sit on that's talking about this, but exactly as you stated, the concept is, should there be a clearinghouse that serves, you know, student athletes are taught how to upload their deals, and does that happen prior to the deal? Is there approval? Is it a reporting mechanism after the fact? But presumably, I know we talked in the professional services provider working group that you would also have to upload any PSPs, if you will, who were involved in the deal. You'd have to, you know, perhaps upload a certification that you're in compliance with the following NCAA rules. In so doing, perhaps some information that could help us discern the timing of the meeting or the relationship and vis-a-vis the inducement and recruiting process. So that's sort of what the concept is really this third-party mechanism, so that one-person compliance offices aren't responsible for vetting, obtaining all of that information. So that's kind of where the discussions have been to date.
And I would just add to that, and to Jill's earlier point, that we are really mindful of the fact that our compliance offices are already so busy with their current responsibilities. So just being thoughtful of how this doesn't become another big layer and heavy lift, and knowing that outside assistance is going to be needed for that. And the whole concept of institutional assistance, but not involvement. In so many of these areas, we're trying to identify the right place to draw that line, because going back to some of Jenn's opening statements, these are student athlete business activities or opportunities to promote themselves and do endorsements independent of university involvement. So finding ways to get that outside assistance and have some general outside platform to do so without being overly burdensome on the institutions is really important.
That's wonderful, thanks. I want to maybe just ask, there are a couple of questions about whether institutional policies could be more strict than a national standard. And in particular, and Kevin noted this in his comments about the conflicts or institutional language, what it means to be a student athlete at that particular institution. We have a couple of questions that are providing the example of, if a student athlete is able to sell his or her autograph using their NIL to promote that availability, would they also then be permitted to say to their institution, I'm not participating in those community engagement opportunities any longer? So Grace, maybe you could share the perspective of the group thinking through how an institution may go forward in this landscape when there are opportunities to monetize certain aspects and what it means to be a student athlete. And then secondly, how an institution's policies sync up with or connect with the national level legislation.
Yeah, and I think I'll take them in reverse order, Jen, because we have always talked about and believed that much like any other legislation that we have, the national is the baseline, and then you can always have stricter conference legislation and institutional legislation. So there are those different layers, and this area will be no different. So while the NCAA legislation will be that baseline, institutions can certainly choose to be more restrictive in areas. And we've talked about how an institution might disclose those things up front, so there is no confusion around that or no hard feelings after the fact. When we look at something like autographs, for instance, and talking about how a student athlete might be able to monetize that, but yet we don't want that to be to the detriment of the whole. And we know that right now, as part of the student athlete experience, our young people are often asked to stay after games to sign autographs or to do a team-based activity around autographs, and that those still should be opportunities that they're doing as part of a team, where they're not expecting compensation for those, because those are team-based activities. So we've talked about when you're a part of a team, when you might be in an institutional facility and doing those team-based activities, versus when you're off on your own without institutional involvement, marketing, promoting yourself, and receiving fair compensation for your name, image, or likeness. So there are a lot of dividing lines, and I think as we develop this legislation, it will become clearer how we're thinking about those dividing lines. But once again, there will always be the opportunity to overlay more restrictive institutional practices if there are particular values on your campus, things your institution feels strongly about that aren't reflected in those national rules.
Thanks, Grace. Jill, maybe you can share with the group, this goes back to the FSL-WG work as well, and has merged into the Division I specific environment. The way that it's envisioned that an institution's multimedia rights holder will or will not be able to participate or work directly with student athletes or not work directly with student athletes, and how that line may be drawn as it relates to institutional involvement.
Sure, that's a topic that we have been spending a considerable amount of time talking about. I think somebody in the Q&A here that I was just browsing through mentioned the Knight Commission. So I think back on April 4th, the Knight Commission issued a couple-pager recommendations on guiding principles, and they were pretty clear that institutional involvement when it comes to brokering these sort of deals, the definition of institution should include its independent contractors, including specifically multimedia rights partners. So that's one sort of option that's out there for general public consumption. I think that the concern is if I've got a multimedia rights partner, I'm proud to say we're with Van Wagner. So if Van Wagner helps us negotiate a deal with Toro to become a departmental sponsor, and then Van Wagner is allowed to turn around and negotiate a deal with a student athlete with Toro, it becomes real gray on the intersection of who's paying and for what. And so that's what we're working through right now. The discussions we're having, we're wide open to membership input on this topic. We're guarding against, and we've made it really clear about no institutional involvement for reasons related to pay for play, inducements, all sorts of good reasons. And so where does that become really difficult? And where do those things kind of merge if your MMR partner is allowed to broker deals with your student athletes? So nothing's been decided. It's a very difficult and interesting topic, and I think we're very open to input. I know we are.
And Jenn, I just add to that as well. Jill did a great job of describing the complexities of that. We are so mindful of the fact that anything that detracts from an institution's ability to sign sponsorship deals and bring in resources for their athletics department as a whole could be detrimental to the athletics programs. And we don't want, we have to be very careful about how those relationships work and be mindful of the fact that we're in the business of giving educational opportunities to a large number of students. So this is really one of those areas where there are just so many pros and cons, and finding the right way to go forward with that is going to be really important.
Thanks, Grace. Appreciate that. And Jill, thanks for scanning the Q&A and picking up the Knight Commission question. You let Kevin off the hook. We have a couple of questions about the use of institutional marks. And maybe, Grace, I'll have you start about where the group is on the use of institutional marks. And the specific question, I think, that probably lays it out very similarly to how the group has talked about it, and I'll just read it. Talk through the use of institutional marks for a student athlete who wants to monetize their presence on social media. For example, does this mean a student athlete who has a YouTube channel or an Instagram following would not be permitted to wear university logoed gear, institutionally issued or not, on those videos?
Yeah, so that's definitely a tricky one. And you heard some of the distinction in Kevin's remarks when we look at the two categories of having first the business activities versus those third-party advertisements and promotions. With the business activities, we have talked about the ability to identify your institution and to identify the fact that you're a student athlete at that institution. And that is a deviation from, I'll say, where the group started out in feeling like there shouldn't be a reference to the institution or the sport. So we fully acknowledge that to properly promote a student athlete's name, image, and likeness, the ability to talk about their school and being a student athlete at that school is important. But when you cross over into marks and intellectual property for the institution, it becomes much more complex. So even in the third-party endorsements, we've talked about no marks, but no reference to the institution as well. So when you look at something like social media and what a student athlete can wear, what they can reference, we understand that we're really threading the needle here of what that will look like, but find that the step of going to the marks brought in degrees of complication. We just felt at this point in time we're not prepared to deal with. Jill, I'm going to look to you with the whole social media aspect, because as Jill mentioned, the federal and state working group really was the group that got quite an education in social media and how that would work. So I'm thinking through, whether you could or could not restrict, what they could wear, what pictures they could use, things like that, and how, again, that adds these layers of complexity. But is that something you've talked through, Jill, with the federal and state group?
Yeah, I would say, and again, Jen, I'm trying to combine a couple questions here. One sort of central theme is going to be, what are your institutional policies? So if you're going to come to Notre Dame and film Rudy, you're going to have a hell of a licensing agreement and a facility and campus use agreement that anybody would have to enter into. If you're doing a vlog and you're a YouTuber and you attend a certain institution, you're probably wearing their sweatshirt and nobody cares. And in some cases, we're hearing from schools and institutions saying, wear my sweatshirt. We like that. So we understand what the institutional landscape is. And the other question I'll weave in, Jen, is I think this also applies to fee for lessons and using facilities at institutions. What are your policies? What do you have your coaches who have LLCs for their camps do? Is there a waiver they have to sign? What's the going rate? I mean, that would be that would be the sort of the framework that we've been operating on, is that this is another example of where institutional policies may come into play and layer in on this. On the other hand, I think, and this is something I've gotten asked a lot about. So in the concepts that are currently out there under business activities, athletically and non-athletically related business activities, the concept we're floating currently says a student athlete could include his or her status as a student athlete and institutional affiliation in promotion of such business activity. I think personally, I remember the discussion about a lot of those business activities where they're putting their entrepreneurial hat on. You're going to be using your email address that has your institution in it. In fact, your email address is your institution. And a lot of that business activity where it would be maybe you're seeking investors from the alumni base, those sort of things. On the other hand, the current concept that we're floating on third-party endorsement says that you could indicate your status as a student athlete in a promotion, but the student athlete would not be permitted to reference his or her institution. So I think to summarize, I think there are 3 levels here. Number 1, institutional involvement in the use of institutional marks. Number 2, identification of your institution. And number 3, how do institutional policies play into this once we sort of figure out where we want the NIL rules to land. I know that's a lot and it's still a little bit gray, but that's sort of how the thought process is going.
I appreciate that very much. Grace, not unlike the questions that we're receiving today from the participants, the conversations that we're having within the council and the Legislative Solutions Group meeting about the enforceability, about what this environment would actually look like. And we use the word guardrails or parameters very frequently. From your perspective, what is envisioned as it relates to the future of violations? Kevin on the list of additional considerations talked about booster involvement. Long back to the very beginning, we have the Board of Governors and the FSLWG principle of protecting the unique recruiting environment. Because we don't have a specific answer, I think that the attendees today would really benefit from hearing your perspective about how we're approaching this new landscape.
So, Jenn, as we think about that in general, we acknowledge, and back to some of my introductory comments, where this is not how we've typically been trained to think in college athletics, because we generally are very regulatory minded, policy minded, and like when things become difficult to control, the easiest thing to do, obviously, is to say no. At the other end of the spectrum, you just let anything happen, and there are no rules. So as we look at now trying to be as permissive as we can, but still ensure that there's an underlying fairness in what's happening, and the involvement of boosters means that we're going to have to ensure first and foremost that they don't do anything to unduly influence the choice of institution. And here's where Val Ackerman has spoken so eloquently about the fact that college athletics is very unique. We're different from the professional leagues where they have a draft and you're told which team you're going to play for, or the Olympics where you play for your country and there's no competition over which country you're representing. So we know that we need to keep that booster influence out of deciding choice of institution. And then with whether it be booster or in any area, we keep going back to saying, what can we control? Where can we put reasonable guardrails in place to ensure as much fairness and high integrity activity as possible? But we also acknowledge that a lot is going to depend on student athletes disclosing what they're doing, boosters disclosing what they're doing. And if we're using some third-party platform, what we see reported in there, and understanding that all our other rules stay in place. So you are still required to do the right thing to ensure that you don't receive an extra benefit, that things are at market value. And there's going to be a lot to sort through to make sure that that does happen fairly. And I think we also acknowledge that however much thought we put into this, and as I look at Jill and the other members of that federal and state working group that met for a year, and Gene Smith of Ohio State he had said any number of times when they deliver that final report, they are disbanded, they are done. It was really some heavy lifting. And I think that our legislative solutions group feels that same way right now, despite the work going into it and these membership engagements. We know there's no possible way we're going to get everything perfectly right from the start. We are going to have to live in this new environment, doing the best we can, and then make adjustments to the things that we see happening that perhaps weren't anticipated, or that we just couldn't construct a perfect guardrail for upfront. So it's part of the everyday conversation, and I think we're getting a lot of good ideas. We've had so many wonderful suggestions submitted already from the membership, and that will continue to happen. But understanding that we're going to have to rely on disclosure, and really, if people aren't doing things with the level of integrity we expect, that there will be some repercussions for that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Grace. I really appreciate it. And I want to just acknowledge for everybody that has typed a Q&A, and I'm really sorry that we're not going to get to all of them, but we are going to capture them. Before I let people go, I just want to note that a lot of you have written in and asked a question about a national education program. And actually, you'd be really proud to know that your Division I SAC has talked a lot about that. They've mentioned that the need for student athletes to be educated at a national level, knowing that additional education will have to happen at either the institution or the conference level. So we absolutely take that feedback. And Jill, I'm going to put you on the clock here. We've got a lot of questions about professional service providers. We call them agents sometimes, and fair market value or compensation. And so can you connect those two together in a couple of minutes and just provide folks where your subgroup is leaning from the professional service provider aspect?
Sure. I think first and foremost, there's unanimous thought that student athletes need access to professional service providers. That the range of what that means and who those are is very broad. So we understand the fact that there are agents who are serving as agents in the context as we currently define it under NCAA rules as representing a student with respect to his or her professional opportunities. We also understand that agents also serve as marketing and brand managers. And so there's going to be some overlap there, and we're working through more that rules would pertain based on the function that the individual's engaging in, rather than what his or her title or whatever they call themselves. But the list goes on, right? There could be financial planners. There will certainly be tax experts. There will be lawyers. There will be, simply brand managers who are maybe very common in the digital space. So we understand there's a wide range of them. That wide range also means, frankly, I think it would be difficult for institutions or even the NCAA centrally to vet everybody who could possibly be providing professional services to our student athletes. So that's something we're really talking through as we speak, and are open to membership input. We've also talked about the variety of financial structures that could be in place with such PSPs. Frankly, the fine line here is between, do we want to talk about going rate, but these going rates, these aren't all individuals who say, here's my hourly fee, pay me. We understand there's going to be a wide range, and there are a wide range of compensation agreements in this area. So there could be contingency. My brand manager takes a percentage of any earnings. There could be a guarantee, an upfront payment. So what's our role in trying to determine, again, how we're ensuring, back to our fundamental principles, that this is payment for use of NIL and not pay for play, or not just a burlap bag full of cash. So those are some of the things that we're working through in the professional service provider working group. And then as it pertains to fair market value, I think that's got two angles. One, back to the going rate for a professional service provider, and am I paying an appropriate rate for that? And we're wrestling through that. And then the bigger picture concept of fair market value of the underlying deal, which I certainly can't attack in my remaining time, other than to say we anticipate the disclosure mechanism playing a significant role in that.
Thanks, Jill. Grace, any final comments you'd like to leave the participants with today?
Just acknowledging once again that there is a lot of work left ahead of us in refining these concepts, and in looking at the timeline going forward. The council will meet again later this month to talk about concepts again, and we have a standing meeting in June, and then again in the fall. But our charge by the Board of Governors was to refine concepts and get them submitted in final form into the governance structure for October, to take place January of 2021. So there's much work ahead of us, but we need to continue working along at a rapid clip. And we just so appreciate you not only tuning in to get educated, but sending those good thoughts forward to inform our work to make sure we get to the right place.
Thanks so much. We appreciate everybody being with us today. Feel free to email us or give us a shout with any additional questions or thoughts that you have. And we look forward to being with you again in the future. Stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.